head troller at his ranch, and he's going to talk about the ranch today. So, go ahead.
I guess we're seeing another nice day. We've had some rain, and so people are happy. It's cooler than I think people are used to, but everything's great. Starting back with the agriculture segment of the AVA Ranch, both farming and ranching, if we look back thousands of years, the Indians were here, or whatever we want to call them, but based on the number of metates, which are Indian grinding stones, and manos, the Indian shards or the pottery shards, we know that there was a lot of agriculture going on, and obviously that was very highly dependent on the climate. If it was wet weather, then they did some dry land farming, and they grew squash, beans, corn, and the little corn cobs were maybe 2 or 3 inches long, and then they, of course, used pinon and mesquite beans, and they ground them up in their Indian grinding stones, which are called metates, and they use manos. But from the numbers that we've had around here, probably hundreds of them on the south part of the ranch, we know that agriculture has played an important part of this general area for many thousands of years. Anyhow, the AVA, which was before the AVA, probably started back in around the turn of the century. Of course, the forest became a national forest preserve in 1902 and a national forest in 1905. But the importance of any farming operation is the amount of moisture that you have. So we know that they originally planted some trees in 1906. How they watered them, we're not sure. But in 1911, William Stewart and his neighbor down the way got together and built the Portal Ditch, and they decided to build it above the ranger station because that was almost always water. When you get down to the bridge or other areas, you don't always see running water. So it's about from here, sitting in front of the barn, it's almost 2 miles of ditch to get where we are. I mean, it's a little bit south of us here, but they did the whole ditch, built the whole ditch by hand. Obviously, Fresnos, horses, mules, and a lot of shoveling. You know, I'm still in awe how they did it because it was a tremendous amount of work. They had to cross a lot of arroyos, and they had all kinds of culverts and pipes and whatever, and most of those, and then back then were probably wooden, and they've been replaced primarily, well, mostly with steel culverts or whatever since then. So anyhow, 1911 started. William Stewart planted the trees, and actually in 1913 planted a lot of apple trees in the 1300 range or so, and hocked the whole place to apples. So he also had to observe that the cottonwood trees stayed greener here on this slope and greened up earlier in the spring. And we're on a pretty good slope and kind of in the confluence between Cave Creek and Silver Creek, so there's always some air movement. And of course, when you have air movement, you don't have extreme heats or extreme cold weather. But anyhow, the ditch was a pretty critical thing in this running this thing. The Gurnetts who were at that, or prior to Gurnetts, I guess, again, William Stewart and Jim Ray were probably the primary guys that built this thing, and as long as there was water, everybody did fine, and when there wasn't, that changed what they could grow. Anyhow, as Stewart went on, we knew we had dry times and wet times, and in I believe 1920, they had a big battle because there wasn't enough water for all the hundreds or thousands of acres, as the ditch went almost down to the Cienega, and there just wasn't enough water for everybody, so they adjudicated it, and whether it was the water commissioner or the judge, I'm not sure, they had a big hearing at the school, and so all these water rights were adjudicated, meaning that we had probably 50 or 60 acres of adjudicated water rights, meaning that you could get 3 acre feet of water for every acre, which is a substantial amount of water. An acre foot is about 326,000 gallons. So anyhow, we had the apple trees for many years, and of course, as time went on, we evolved from dirt ditches, and then of course Dr. Adamson through Christopher and Drone built a lot of concrete, not concrete, rock ditches, and then that evolved into concrete ditches through the Soil Conservation Service in the early 50s, and of course now we're all aluminum and sprinkler system, and we went from probably a water efficiency, if you figure what we pumped, from 50% of what you pumped to getting it where you wanted, to probably 90 to 95% with aluminum pipe, because you didn't, at the beginning of the ditch, you didn't go way below the root zone, and at the end of the ditch you didn't have to worry about accumulating a lot of tailwater to get the water down to the root zones. Well, anyhow, as we look at how things were watered, again, then in 1935, Dr. Adamson, who at that time owned the place, who was a physician in Douglas, Arizona, decided to drill a well, and he drilled a well up probably where he thought there was a confluence again of the Silver Creek and Cave Creek faults or whatever it is, and he drilled a well, let's say in about 1935, and he drilled it down to about 200 feet. At that time, all that you could, the old well drilling equipment, that's about as far as it would go. So they drilled down, got to 200 feet, didn't get any substantial, or at least the irrigation quantity of water. So they contacted him and said, well, put dynamite in there. Well, they dropped a stick of dynamite and called him back, said nothing, or however they come in and said nothing happened. So he said, put some dynamite down there. So they may have put a half a case or a lot of dynamite down there. And anyhow, kaboom, and they blew a hole that was so deep that several hundred feet of cord, they could not find the bottom of the well, whether it was running water, whether it was in a fault, whether it was an underground cavern, but it was in limestone. So we know we have a tremendous amount of water. And for years we pumped, of course we're not now, but for years we pumped at 500 to 600 gallons a minute, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and never even touched it. And we have a windmill, it's about 40 or 50 feet away from it, and it was in a different water whatever, and it never was impacted by how much we were pumping. And of course we were using propane and gas, or propane and diesel as fuels, and of course as those fuels went to 10, 20 times what it cost back then, it just got to be prohibitive to continue the farming, either with the apple trees or the peach trees or an alfalfa. Well, anyhow, the apple trees were at the end of their lifetime when my father bought the place in the early 50s, and for up to that time they had been, had been pretty prosperous, my guess is, but there was enough rainwater, enough water to keep them going, and it wasn't large enough that they had a huge market. They sold probably a lot of the produce or the apples to Phelps Dodge in Douglas, into the local markets. We also made cider early on, and that was kind of a fun exercise. But again, we don't do that. There are various state and government or federal regulations. It just gets into more hassle than it's worth. Well, anyhow, as we pulled out the apple trees, and with the Soil Conservation Service and the county agent and some of the local people that had experience, we re-leveled the land, which probably wasn't wise at the time, because we're pretty gravelly, rocky soil, and of course where there was good soil, we moved it around, and of course you could irrigate easier, but it was now we got some really dry spots because they just won't hold the water. Anyhow, we planted peach trees and did fairly well with the peaches. All the best fruit primarily went to Safeway chains, one in El Paso and one in Phoenix, and they both had 50 or 60 big stores, and that was a big market. And all the culls went primarily to El Paso for the Juarez market. When we also had a number of people that would come from Juarez in their old vehicles and put springs in there and put in 400 or 500 pounds of cull peaches and take them back and sell them. How they did, I don't know, but they'd come back not day after day, but 2 or 3 times a week. We also had a lot of people that would can peaches. We don't see that as much anymore, but they would buy, a lot of women would come over and they'd buy 100 or 200 pounds of peaches, and whatever they did, whether they quartered them or halved them and they'd canned all those, and then they'd come back the next day and buy another 200 pounds. And, you know, they just did a lot of work. Today it's probably not efficient as because of the cost of the canning equipment and the sugar and the time. Young people just don't seem to have that energy to do that. But I do know the LDS people from in the Animas area did it an awful lot, and they still question me when we're going to have peaches so they can do that again. Anyhow, as the peaches, as the trees gradually aged, and we had a real problem because most of the root stock came from either Stark Brothers in Missouri or Bonneville Ridge up in Washington or Oregon State, and we don't have the extreme temperature variations that we do here. So you figure in the afternoon, the temperature, the bark temperature to 4 hours later could change 30 or 40 degrees pretty rapidly. So of course the outside bark was expanding, contracting much faster than the inside bark, and so after 12 to 14 years, the trees just weren't bearing. The productivity just dropped off. They just weren't bearing. So we looked at it how we could do it, and so I started pulling out some of the older trees, and I thought I'd replace them with apples. And of course, my big buyers at Safeway said probably Washington State would just bury you with their big co-ops up there. So we didn't look at apples and didn't want to continue with peaches because that market also had changed very drastically. We just don't have the fresh fruit market that we had back then. And what you do buy in Walmart or Safeway or any other market today, the peaches are picked 2 or 3 weeks before they're ripened, so they don't have much of a flavor. But we've had, even up to not too long ago, people still come up to me and said, those are the best peaches that we ever had. Well, of course, they were the best peaches you ever had because we could keep them on the tree. And the longer you keep them on the tree, the better flavor and the juicier they were. Well, anyhow, still having to decide how or what we were going to do, we knew that our cost of energy had gone up 10 times. And so I thought, well, this had been in agriculture since 1911, probably between 1906 and 1911. So I thought, well, I'll put some hay in, and of course, hay puts nitrogen back in the soil and improves the soil. And so we tried that, and that we did pretty well because part of the ranch is also cattle, and so with hay and cattle, it was kind of a natural, just natural. We made some money. And of course, all the ranchers didn't have to go so far to get hay, and there weren't no one else was growing hay around here. Everyone was growing in rodeo or growing primarily cotton or maize, but very little hay because they just couldn't make any money at it. But I was getting 6 or 7 cuttings and averaging probably 8 to 10 tons an acre. And with our natural rainfall of about 17 or 18 plus the water coming from the creek, it made it economic. But once the creek doesn't run and it's dry, then you're pumping completely, and it didn't work. Also, we had an extremely dry part of that segment of time. The white, or the mule deer were pretty migratory. They're not as territorial as whitetail. And we could go down on the east side of the field any night, and you'd see 100 or 100. You couldn't even count how many deer were in there. Well, of course, that just took all the profit away. And, of course, tried to help the Game and Fish, asked them for help. And Kim Murphy said, well, I can't really do anything. And so we came up with an idea somewhere. I think my father found in the Wall Street Journal a little blurb that said, a lot of people are having problem with deer, but if you put some lion dung in their track, they'll skirt away from it. Well, that worked fine for 2 or 3 days until the lion dung dried up, or they moved a little bit. But when they're hungry enough, they'll overcome the scent of the lion. And we couldn't get enough lion dung anyhow. I mean, cat or whatever it is. So I just then decided, well, I've got to do something. And of course, most of my equipment was oversized. So I did a lot of custom work between here and Animas, and we had some, it was expensive equipment. I had a bale hauling machine that you could drive it down the highway at 50 miles an hour with a full load on it. Well, it was pretty efficient, and I was getting a dime a bale on the thing, and I could haul 10, 15, or about 1,000 to 1,500 bales a day after I did all my other things. And it didn't take very long, and so that kind of sustained us for a while. But also had 2 balers and swathers and tremendous amount of money tied up in equipment. And of course, the maintenance of the equipment is high. Anyhow, we proceeded with the hay, and that seemed to work okay until the deer just decimated us, and that was a dry time. We tried deer fences, and of course that was a pretty expensive thing. We had the same problems with the peaches and the apples. When you have a dry years, the wildlife just, there's just so many you can't even deal with them. We of course all along we had cattle, so I mean cattle and hay was just a natural, but we always had cattle. We also, when we had the peaches, to any of the overripes, culls, or whatever we couldn't sell, we always kept 50 or 60 feeder pigs and fed them peaches, and also had self feeders that we put grain in there, and of course they did great gains, and they were great when you butchered them. But we'd haul them up to Cudahy in Phoenix, a load of maybe 40 or 50 at a time, and Cudahy closed down, and then the government came out and said, we can't buy those anymore because they're garbage-fed hogs. So that took care of another aspect of the avenue of how do you make money to survive, and the government just flat took it away from us. And of course, the economies of scale changed things. So then I decided we'll just pull out more of the trees and put in more hay. But anyhow, as I say, that became less and less efficient. You just couldn't make any money, so we just primarily focused on cattle. And so all of the country now is where we had trees or alfalfa, is we water it when there is water from the creek, and we have a pretty solid sod of grass, which you can't find in the desert because there's just not enough moisture. But we do, the soil conservation guy came over, Ron Bemis came out, and we took a plat of land, and we wanted to see how much we could graze with it. Well, it produced enough in that one, I think it was a square meter or whatever it was of land, that it equated that we could have run about 100 cows per section here, meaning one cow, a lot of cows per section. Normally in this country, most of it in the Portal area, you're talking about 10 cows per section, 1 cow to 64 acres. So you can see that you increase by watering up, tenfold. Well, of course, we get the water out of the creek, and we get the water. We preserve the water right, which goes with the land. We also have a lot of debris coming down, a lot of leaves, oak leaves and whatever, so we're building up our soil. And also we get the seeds, some of the grama grasses that are hard to find come down in the creek, and we've established several grama grass areas on the ranch, and of course that's about as good a grazing as you can get, because the grama grasses hold their protein drier, when it's green or when it's dry. And so we've managed to survive with running cattle, and you don't need to run as, when you're not making these huge equipment payments and huge fuel payments and fuel and et cetera payments. You can survive on a lot less than you could when you have these big payments and big expenses. So now we still have the expenses that are, the taxes, everything keeps going up, and it's an unfortunate thing that is forcing people in production agriculture out of the business, because they want to produce and protect what they have, but you can't just keep losing money. So we're seeing more and more people just selling out, and it's kind of a sadness, because there are not very many people that come in are going to farm it or ranch it. They're going to subdivide it or do something else with it. So we're looking at all kinds of things that we could do or not do. The big thing is, on this particular facility, when my father bought it, or 50, 60, 70 years ago, there were probably 27 buildings here. Today, there are 17 buildings, and I've torn down several of them. 2 of them burned, and we have 17 buildings. But just taking care of the buildings is very, very expensive. The insurance, etc. So we've kept all the rock buildings, the brick buildings, and the ones that are solid, trying to keep roofs on those things until we can decide whether we want to do something with them. With the excess houses, we've tried renting them, and we're just not in the renting business. And most people are out here are pretty, their way of making a living is pretty minimal, so that we're always behind on rents, and we provide them with electricity and gas to heat them, and they don't think anything of keeping the doors open in the cold weather, and it just, so I'm just not doing it anymore. And it's we've had houses fully furnished with furniture, everything, and of course it's just those things just disappear. Of course, they naturally depreciate with time anyhow, but a lot of stuff just plain disappears. Anyhow, back to the agriculture side, we're seeing the ranches around us, the people are surviving, and I think the government finally realized that the average age of the production agricultural person today is way up in the 60s or whatever it is, and so they've introduced programs so that young people with credit that are somewhat creditworthy can acquire long-term low-interest loans. I'm not sure whether they're 20 or 30 years and at a relatively low interest, obviously below market. So we're seeing some younger people acquiring some of these ranches around us, which I think is good. But I mean, these kids, I won't say kids, are substantially younger than I am. They're paying 1.5, 1.7, $2 million for some of these ranches, and they're making it work. Of course, they've got family, they're going to do it. But on the other side of the coin, we're seeing a lot of very wealthy people coming in and buying these ranches. And the Walmart family, whether it's Walmart money or other money, have just bought 3 of the big ranches to the south of us, the Snores, the Kimballs, and now we're seeing the Miracle of Omaha son is. They've bought ranches, and big truck lines buying ranches, and of course we understand what they're doing. They're tying up huge chunks of land, which is a good investment for them. The taxes on most agricultural properties are what we call they have agricultural exemptions, so the taxes aren't nearly as high as holding pieces of land. So we're having some changes there, and of course none of these people or the owners live here, so they don't really understand the issues of schools, the issues of roads, the issues of infrastructure. So we have a concern of what ultimately is going to happen to the small communities. And then of course down in San Simon and over by Apache, we're having these huge pecan orchards being planted, or have been in for a few years, probably 8 to 10 now, but they're still planting. And what's going to happen there, because they take a tremendous amount of water, and we'll just have to wait and see. But again, it's all outside money. Very few, none of these people that have these huge investments live here. They all live in California, or who knows where they live, but not here. I know in the case of FICO, which is Farmers Investment, they had huge pecan orchards south of Tucson in Green Valley, Sarita area. And of course, when I was at the University of Arizona, Keith Walden had been in the cotton business and started planting pecans, and he made a good choice. Anyhow, they have 4,000 or 5,000 acres over there, and of course they've got probably about the same amount here, and then of course other companies come in, but a lot of foreign investment. So we're seeing a real change in agriculture, which is pretty frightening. We could buy a tractor for $4,000 or $5,000, a 70, 80 horsepower tractor, and that same tractor today, 70 or 80 horsepower, is probably 100,000, maybe not quite that much, but it has every computer gadget on it that you need. And we look at it, when I started out, none of the tractors had power steering or power brakes, and at the end of the day, of driving, disking, or whatever we do to drive a tractor, your shoulders felt like they're going to fall off. And of course, once we got power steering and power brakes, we just thought that was pretty neat. And of course, now they have air conditioned and heated cabs on their things, and everything in there that you could ever think about needing, I suspect. But anyhow, just how the world has changed, and we expect change, and we know change is happening, but we're not sure where things ultimately will evolve. We have the concerns, obviously, of water resources, what's happening if it doesn't rain, and we haven't seen substantial snowfall up in the top of the Chiricahuas for a number of years, and That's probably where a lot of our recharge comes from. We're concerned about fires because as it gets dry, and of course, right now we're just seeing a lot of houses where we didn't see houses. And so if you had a fire 100 years ago, who cared? Today, there are houses, there are utilities, there's roads, there are all kinds of things that can be destroyed, so people have a different attitude of how they're going to take care of things. Other thing is we see the Forest Service used to always have people out in the field. They had one or two people here, plus in fire season they always had fire crews, and when they weren't on fires they worked trails, and so things worked pretty well. One of the rangers I remember, his name was Dick Albert, and he had an office in the post office in Douglas, and it wasn't a very big office, had a part-time secretary. And everyone else is out in the field. Now it's the other way around. Everybody's in the office and no one's in the field. So we wonder sometimes about the management, but it is what it is. And I guess pendulums swing back and forth, and we'll see what happens. But we're just seeing that they, of course, don't have any money, but I think they have a lot of legal pressures, a lot of environmental pressures to do this or do that. And I think that they're finally wising up now after seeing these fires in California, that you've got to manage the forest. And one of the things we see if you go to Pine Top or to Ruidoso, you can see where the Indians manage their forest, and they thin the trees where the Forest Service doesn't do anything. They just leave it like it is. And of course they say they don't have any money, but we don't have any. We're not cutting lumber. We're not doing any of the things that we used to do to preserve the forest. And of course, once you have a fire, it's gone. And it concerns a lot of people, but I think as our society changes, we're seeing, employees out in the forest, just that was their forest. Today, now all they're worried about is the paycheck and making advancements and the retirement. They don't have the kind of concern. I won't say everybody, but we're just seeing that general trend. But I think that's the way our society is headed, and they have to. How are you going to survive if you don't have a pretty good paycheck? I mean, it's just expensive, whether it's food or cars or whatever you do to survive. Anyhow, back to the ranch. We evolved in irrigation, figuring that was probably our one biggest expense. So as I say, we evolved from dirt ditches to rock ditches to cement ditches to aluminum pipe, which was a substantial investment. But we worked that out. We still have a lot of the aluminum pipe, and you can see it in the back. Well, I'm not sure if you can see it behind me or not, but it stays there for a long time. And of course, the price of aluminum keeps going up, so I guess we can always scrap that and get our money back. But we're not using it except when the creek's running, and then we use it as coming through one of the head gates. We run it into the pipes and let it gravity irrigate, and it works pretty well. As I say, we've changed it from a pretty barren thing to almost a solid grass cover of I mean, there are probably 10 or 12 different kinds of grasses, and we can raise or graze them year round, but we've changed things a little around because I used to graze in the fall and graze all the grass off to reduce the fire danger. And we let it go this year because we had an unusual summer rain. It was okay, but it just didn't come in a good times. It's pretty amazing how we've evolved. The equipment's evolved on any farm or ranch today from 100 years ago or whatever it was. And we talk about tractors that were 20 or 30 horsepower. Today we're talking 80, 100, or even larger row crop tractors. Here we had various kinds of hay equipment, and you look at how the hay and the balers had progressed, and it's absolutely just amazing. And of course, everything used to be by hand. We had loose hay, and we used buck rakes, and you'd sit on that rake behind a tractor and click it every so often. Then you had these big piles, and you came along with a wagon and pitchforked it all into the wagon and ultimately up in the barn. And of course, as kids, naturally that wasn't very much fun. And of course, it was always in the summer, and it was hot, and it was not a fun thing. As we evolved into balers, we went through a number of balers that they'd miss about one out of every 4 or 5 ties, so you'd have piles of hay everywhere in some bales, and ultimately the newer bales, it'd go 6, 8, 10,000 bales without even breaking a tie. And and we also, I mean, the rakes, the balers, and then we had New Holland and devised these bale wagons that you could pick. The baler twisted the bale so it fell on its side, and you came along with these bale wagons and could pick up 60, 80 bales at a time, and of course that made a barn obsolete because you just couldn't get them into the barn. So we had stacks of hay outside, and it was pretty amazing. You could do a lot of things that it used to be full time here, and then with this equipment I could spend 3 or 4 hours a day here and go and work on other farms picking up hay or baling hay or mowing hay, and it was just an amazing to see how things change, and it was a heck of a lot more comfortable. I was never fortunate enough to have air-conditioned cabs for everything, but we managed because you didn't have to deal with everything by hand. Anyhow, as I said, the same thing with the packing shed. Everything used to be by hand, and then we devised, or we didn't devise. We bought some equipment that sized the equipment or sized the peaches so it would made it a lot easier for packing for the gals. And of course, during the peak peach season, we had, of course, four full-time people working all time because you started out pruning trees and then cleaning up the trees and putting out smudge pots and all the things that you did. And of course, smudge pots were more of an insurance policy. We never lost a crop due to frost, and that's down in the bottom of the valley. Rarely do they get peaches, and when they do, everybody has them. But so we are fortunate because of the slope here. We just never got a killer. Anyhow, back to the labor. The gals, we'd have people working in the packing shed and the people picking, and we'd have anywhere from 40 to 60 people working part-time. And of course, anybody that's worked people knows how much fun that is, keeping track of everything and still managing the whole deal. But anyhow, we managed, and they were packing, they were hauling down, and we had a cooler that holds about 2 semi-loads of peaches underneath the packing shed, and there's an elevator. Of course, it's the only elevator in Portal that I'm aware of, and it hauled them up and down, and then we'd load trucks, and that always took several people because today it's all mechanized. You can move a lot of things with relatively few people. So anyhow, we always had a lot of people here, and we started way back when, and when we first came here, or I first came here in 1953, the summer of 53, we had a foreman. His name was Slim Mingus, and he could just about do anything. He could drive the tractor, he could shoe a horse, he could brand calves, he could, anything that needed to be done. He was just a jack of all trade. He was a World War II veteran, and he had, let me think, 5 kids, 3 boys and 2 girls. And of course, the older boys were going to school, I think, in Bisbee because they had an aunt living there, and we didn't have any accredited or high schools close. I mean, Animas and San Simon, but they were all really dirt roads, and it took a long time to get there, probably an hour either way. So most of us boarded in Bisbee or Douglas or wherever they were. But anyhow, they had 5 kids, and the 2 younger, the girls went to school here, and they left I think in the mid-50s, and I'm not sure where they went, but it was just amazing that every day you did something different, and he knew how to do it. And then we went through several more foremen. One's name was Stoner, George Stoner, and he was another World War II veteran. He had been up in Attu, and of course where it had been cold, and they had several kids. Unfortunately, they lost their daughter. She was pretty young, and I can't remember what happened exactly, but she had some rare blood disease or something happened. Whether it was leukemia, I don't really know. But anyhow, she's buried up in paradise. But that was a sad, sad event. I think that was in 1958 or 59. I can't remember exactly. So we've lost, and then the next foreman's name was Don Williams, and he was another guy, and he lost a son who drowned up in our rock tank. So I didn't want to use that anymore. But anyhow, we've had a lot born here, and a lot died. Izzy Dominguez, I know, was born here, and I think in 1939 or 1940, and his father was I don't know what he did, but he was working here, and his 2 brothers were born in Portal, the twin brothers, and one of them still living in Rodeo. Izzy's long gone, but the brother Joe is down in Rodeo, and he's in his 80s, I guess. All these guys are getting a little bit older, but we had a lot of people here, and my father always felt very strongly about hiring families with several children to keep the school going. And so for many, many years, my parents were on the school board and I was on the school board, but we always tried to hire families with kids to keep the school going. So when I graduated from Portal School in 1954, I think there were 20-something kids in the class in K through, or not K, but first through 8th grade, and then probably at least 8 or 10 more kids that were in high school going to various places. So anyhow, we've seen lots of people, lots of the people come back and remember the good old days of on the ranch and the peaches and whatever they did, and they just had some pretty pleasant memories. We, as I say, I graduated from Portal School in 1954, and then went on to Douglas High School and to the University of Arizona. But we always had, or I had 4-H calves. My little sister had sheep, and little sister and brother had sheep with 4-H projects. And when we went into Douglas, we were involved in FFA, and had kept calves because I stayed outside of town and where I could keep my FFA calves. Anyhow, my sister did very well. She showed sheep all over the state, etc., and won all kinds of ribbons, and that was a kind of neat thing. Of course, sheep on a cattle ranch isn't the coolest thing, but my parents were, everybody kind of understood because Chris would do it. And anyhow, these guys would come and see me, and two of them, my old friend Eric Hayes, who passed away a couple years ago, and Izzy Dominguez, who was born here and of course lived in Rodeo, and they'd come by and see me, and I was pretty popular. Well, until they informed me a few years ago, we weren't coming to see you, we were coming to see your little sister Chris. So that kind of deflated my balloon a little bit, but anyhow, that's how life is. So it was just a great place to live. So many people have come and gone through here. Abby Rockefeller, David Rockefeller's daughter, was here, and she was a little different, but I guess if you're a multi-millionaire, you would be a little bit different. But my mom thought that'd been a good place, good person for me to meet, but I wasn't overly interested in it at the time. But we've had a lot of fun. There were always a lot of kids around here. Today, you just don't see kids in Portal like you did. And what we did at night, I mean, we didn't have television. We had a Friday night movie down in Rodeo, and it used to be in the old school and then in the school, and it was moved around several places because it wasn't big enough. But that was in the early 50s, and that was fun. Of course, once television showed up, then that went away. And what we did after, we'd have a picnic or a hot dog, a hamburger cookout. We played kick the can, and we'd play kick the can by the hour. And I think that's something kids don't know today, but they have too many other ways of entertaining themselves that we didn't have. I mean, you read and the lights went out at a certain time. We didn't have power here, electric, as we know it, until the early 50s. And of course, we had generators on the ranch. We had 3 generators, one to run all the packing equipment, and one to run the big house, and one to run the other houses. So things were a little different then, and we've adjusted to it, and of course we enjoy it a little more just flicking a switch and having power, and the same thing with the telephone. We had an old crank telephone that was hooked up to the Forest Service system that went to all the lookouts. And of course, once the radios came out in the late 50s, early 60s, they abandoned that, and that caused a real issue for what were we going to do for our phones. And our particular phone at the main house was two longs and 3 shorts. And of course, emergency was 3 shorts. And of course, anytime you heard somebody's ring, there was always a couple of the old ladies that just pick up to see what the heck was going on. Well, after the second or third one, the voices could barely be heard, so you'd have to tell them, "Can you get off the phone?" And then you'd hear a little click, click, and then you could talk again. But anyhow, that worked for a little while. But anyhow, in the early 60s, we realized that we didn't have any communication, so I think some of the fathers of here and other parts of the county got together, and I know we went to the Gadsden Hotel in Goldwater, and Hayden and some of the old politicians came down and said, "How can we help you?" And I said, "What are we going to do?" Well, of course, at that time, REA was strictly electricity. Well, then they got involved in telephone, so we we didn't start, but the Little Valley telephone system got started, and Colonel Pug was our first director from here, and anyhow, we started out with 8 party lines and above the lines. Anyhow, we've gotten to, so we have a pretty nice system right now, and it pays capital credits, which is even greater. But anyhow, Pugsley was the first director from Portal area, and Pug decided he wanted to retire in 1977 or 78 or somewhere around there, and he asked my dad if he would be a director, and my dad, of course, had been one of the founders, and said no, he wasn't interested, but maybe I would. And I said, well, I was already on the school board, so I said, I think I better wait until I'm off of the school board and some of these other things before I get on. So we got on, and I was on the Valley Telephone Board for about 20 years, and also, of course, we were on the school board for 12 plus years, and we were on the Columbus Electric Board for 6 years. We were on the county planning and zoning when we first started that in the early 70s, and was on that for 6 years, and usually as vice chairman or chairman. So we've had a lot of experience, and all these things took a tremendous amount of time, because the planning and zoning meeting was in Bisbee, the Columbus Electric was in Deming, the telephone was in Wilcox. Of course, the school board was here until we consolidated with San Simon, but took a lot of traveling, took a lot of time, and I decided I'd put in 40 or 50 years in various community activities and decided enough is enough, so got off of all of them until I got recruited to be the president of the Paradise Cemetery Association, and and some of these other things that we're working on, the Historical Association that many years ago were not really even thought about. Anyhow, pretty pleasant place to live, and I don't think I'd trade it for anything. You look at living here, and we have a lot of quite elderly people that live here, and of course I kind of joke about it. I said there are a couple of reasons for that. One, everybody has their own well that's not contaminated with anything from the cities, and who knows what they put into the water. And the other one is we don't have any traffic stress. The closest traffic light's an hour away. So anyhow, we still have a lot of good people here. A lot of the old timers, as we knew them, are all gone. There are a few of us. What Wayne Morrow used the term of the young old timers, or the younger old timers, and most of us are gone. And I mean, Eric Hayes is gone, and Wayne Morrow's gone. All these people have lived here for many years. Jim Cox and I think, are a few of the left here in the Arizona side. Of course, we have a number of them in rodeo. I think Larry Kimball is another one, and of course Junior Gomez, and we have a lot of Somozas in rodeo. But it's very rapidly changing, and I think one of the things we're kind of enthused about is a lot of people are interested in the history, and hopefully we can convey some of that history through some of these interviews, and would help in the future to see where we are. One of the things we're working on is the John Hands Museum is donating that to the Chiricahua Peloncille Historical Society, and which we will do. We're presently waiting for the surveyor, who was supposed to be here today but deferred till Friday. So we'll donate that, and we'll have a repository to put a lot of these things in that we have no place to put them. And the things that we did have in the museum, we've passed on to the Arizona Historical Society. Alden Hayes and I did that, but it had been broken into so many times that we felt that there'd be some value. And of course, those are all John Hansing. That was another story of how he collected all these things, but it was a pretty neat collection. So anyhow, that's pretty much how we are. As I say, we're not in a perfect place, but as we say, we're not too far from paradise, even though it is kind of a crooked road to get there.